You watch your 3-month-old baby lying on her back, hands moving in the air above her face, fingers spreading and closing in what looks like a delicate dance. You smile. She's discovering her hands, you think. Isn't that what babies do? Your mother-in-law comments on how the baby stares at the ceiling fan for long stretches, barely blinking, and you laugh it off because babies love patterns, don't they? Your pediatrician nods approvingly at the 4-month checkup, everything seems fine, and you leave feeling reassured. But what if I told you that hidden within these seemingly normal baby behaviors, there are subtle patterns that neurodevelopmental specialists recognize as early indicators of autism, patterns so quiet and so easily dismissed that most parents miss the critical window when intervention could reshape a child's entire developmental trajectory. The reality is that autism doesn't suddenly appear at age 2 or 3. It announces itself much earlier, in the first months of life, through specific repetitive movements and sensory patterns that look innocent to untrained eyes but carry profound meaning to those who know what to watch for. Here's what makes this particularly challenging for parents. We live in a culture that celebrates developmental milestones but rarely educates families about the nuanced signs that appear between those milestones. We're told to watch for smiling, for rolling over, for babbling, but nobody prepares us to notice the quality of a baby's gaze, the rhythm of their hand movements, or the way they orient to sound versus light. The medical system, while well-intentioned, operates on a model that waits for clear delays before acting, often missing the opportunity to intervene during the most plastic period of brain development. Between birth and 3 years old, a child's brain forms over 1 million neural connections per second. This is the golden window. This is when gentle, relationship-based intervention can literally reshape neural pathways, but only if we recognize what we're seeing. The problem is compounded by the fact that many early autism signs overlap with typical infant behavior. All babies engage in some repetitive movements. All babies have sensory preferences. The difference lies in the intensity, the frequency, the context, and most importantly, whether these behaviors exist alongside emerging social connection or begin to replace it. What I'm about to share with you isn't meant to create fear or to have you scrutinizing every hand flutter your baby makes. This is about building your observational literacy, about understanding that early recognition isn't about labeling a child but about ensuring they receive support during the most critical period of development. The concept of stereotypies, which refers to repetitive, rhythmic movements that appear to serve no functional purpose, has been studied extensively in autism research. These movements are distinct from the exploratory, goal-oriented movements typical babies make. When a 6-month-old waves their arms excitedly because they see their mother approach, that's functional movement tied to social connection. When a 6-month-old waves their arms in the same pattern for minutes at a time while staring at their hand with intense focus, disconnected from the environment around them, that's a stereotypy. The distinction matters because it reveals something about how the child's nervous system is organizing itself. In neurotypical development, babies quickly learn that the most interesting things in their world are faces, voices, and interactive play. Their attention naturally gravitates towards social stimuli. In autism, the nervous system often finds more regulation and satisfaction in predictable, self-generated sensory input. This isn't a moral failing or a choice. It's a difference in how the brain processes and prioritizes information from the environment. The first sign appears in what we call visual fixations combined with hand stereotypies. Picture a 2-month-old baby who spends unusually long periods, sometimes 10 to 15 minutes or more, staring at sources of light or high-contrast patterns while simultaneously engaging in repetitive hand movements. These aren't brief glances. These are sustained, intense visual focuses where the baby seems locked into the stimulus. The hands might flutter rapidly near the face, fingers spreading and closing in rhythm, or the baby might repeatedly bring both hands together and apart in a precise pattern. What makes this significant isn't that the baby is interested in light or patterns, because all babies are drawn to visual contrast as their vision develops. What matters is the intensity, the duration, and the fact that this visual motor pattern becomes the baby's preferred activity, sometimes even superseding interest in feeding or social interaction. Parents often describe these moments as the baby being content or self-soothing, and in a sense they are, but they're self-regulating through repetitive sensory input rather than through connection with a caregiver. The neuroscience here is fascinating. The developing autistic brain often experiences what researchers call increased neural noise, where the sensory processing centers are flooded with more information than they can easily organize. Repetitive visual focus combined with rhythmic hand movements creates predictability, and predictability calms an overwhelmed nervous system. It's a form of self-regulation, but one that, when it dominates early experience, can limit the baby's motivation to engage with the unpredictable, complex world of faces and social interaction. The second sign involves what specialists call oral motor stereotypies, which most parents interpret as normal mouthing behavior. All babies explore objects with their mouths. That's expected and healthy. But watch for a baby who engages in specific, repeated tongue movements that aren't related to feeding, exploration, or communication attempts. This might look like the tongue repeatedly pushing in and out in a rhythmic pattern, or the baby making the same clicking sound over and over, or pursing and relaxing the lips in a precise sequence that seems automatic rather than exploratory. These movements often occur when the baby is alone or understimulated, and they have a mechanical quality to them. Again, the key is pattern and context. A 4-month-old who occasionally sticks their tongue out while discovering their mouth is typical. A 4-month-old who spends significant portions of their day engaged in the same exact tongue movement, seemingly unaware of or uninterested in their surroundings while doing it, warrants closer observation. These oral stereotypies reflect the same underlying pattern as the hand movements, the nervous system seeking regulation through predictable, self-generated sensation. The mouth is incredibly rich in sensory receptors, and for a baby whose brain is struggling to make sense of environmental input, creating their own controlled oral sensations can feel organizing and safe. The third sign is subtle and often completely missed, the absence or unusual quality of what's called social babbling. Typical babies begin to vocalize in ways that are clearly directed at caregivers, usually by 4 to 6 months. They make sounds while looking at a parent's face, they pause as if expecting a response, and they show pleasure when the adult responds vocally. This back and forth, even before words exist, is the foundation of language development. In babies who will later be diagnosed with autism, you might notice that vocalizations are present, sometimes quite frequent, but they lack this social quality. The baby might coo or babble extensively while looking at objects, at lights, or at their own hands, but rarely while making eye contact or in response to a caregiver's voice. Or the vocalizations might have an unusual repetitive quality, the same sound or sound pattern produced over and over without variation or social intent. Some parents describe it as the baby talking to themselves. What's happening developmentally is that the baby is discovering their voice, which is wonderful, but they're not yet discovering that their voice is a tool for connection. The neural circuits that link vocalization with social reward and turn-taking aren't lighting up the way they typically do. This doesn't mean the baby isn't capable of connection. It means their brain is wiring slightly differently, and early intervention can help strengthen those social communication pathways during this critical period. The fourth sign involves repetitive body rocking or bouncing that appears before the baby has the motor control to intentionally rock themselves. You'll notice a 3 or 4-month-old who, when placed on their back, repeatedly arches their back and releases in a rhythmic pattern, or who rocks their head side to side in a very regular rhythm when lying down or sitting supported. This is different from the brief arching that all babies do when uncomfortable or the head-turning babies do to look around. These are sustained, rhythmic, almost trance-like movements that the baby seems to find soothing but that don't serve a clear exploratory or communicative function. Some parents notice that these movements intensify when the baby is tired, overstimulated, or alone, which makes sense from a sensory regulation perspective. The vestibular system, which controls our sense of balance and movement in space, is a powerful regulator of the nervous system. Rhythmic rocking stimulates this system in a predictable way, creating a sense of organization and calm. For babies whose nervous systems are more easily dysregulated, who experience the world as overwhelming or chaotic, self-generated vestibular input becomes a reliable tool for feeling settled. The concern isn't that the baby is rocking. The concern is when rocking or other rhythmic movements become the primary way the baby regulates, potentially at the expense of learning to co-regulate with a caregiver. The fifth sign is perhaps the most misunderstood, an unusual relationship with sensory input that shows up as either extreme seeking or extreme avoiding, often even in very young babies. You might notice a 2-month-old who seems unusually bothered by typical household sounds, startling intensely or crying inconsolably at noises that other babies barely register. Or conversely, a baby who seems almost under-responsive to sound, not consistently turning toward their parent's voice or not reacting to loud noises that should cause a startle. In the visual realm, some babies show an intense fascination with spinning objects, tracking them with an unusual focus even in the first months of life, or they might stare at their hands moving in front of light sources for extended periods. With touch, you might see a baby who seems uncomfortable with certain textures against their skin, arching away from soft fabrics that should be soothing, or a baby who seeks intense touch and seems not to be satisfied by gentle stroking, needing much more pressure to register and respond to physical contact. These aren't the typical sensory preferences all babies have. These are more extreme, more consistent, and more interfering with the baby's ability to settle into comfortable interaction with caregivers. The sensory processing differences we see in autism exist from birth. The brain is receiving and interpreting sensory information differently, and babies do what they can to either get more of the input they're craving or protect themselves from the input that feels overwhelming. Now, before we go further, I need you to hear something crucial. If you're recognizing some of these patterns in your own baby, your first response might be fear or guilt. Let me be completely clear about this. You have done nothing wrong. Autism is neurobiological. It's not caused by parenting, by vaccines, by how you held your baby or what you fed them. If your baby shows these signs, it means their brain is developing along a different pathway, and that pathway was set in motion by a complex interaction of genetics and prenatal environment that was completely beyond your control. What is within your control, right now, is your response to what you're seeing. Early recognition isn't about labeling or limiting your child. It's about understanding them more deeply and getting them support during the exact period when their brain is most responsive to intervention. The research on early intervention for autism is extraordinarily hopeful. Studies show that relationship-based therapies started before age 2 can significantly improve social communication outcomes, not by trying to make an autistic child not autistic, but by supporting the development of skills that make navigating a social world more accessible and less overwhelming. Here's what happens when parents notice these early signs and act on them. First, you start by trusting your instincts while also seeking professional guidance. If you're seeing multiple stereotypies, if you're noticing that your baby seems more interested in objects and patterns than in faces, if you're feeling that something about your baby's sensory responses or movement patterns seems different, speak with your pediatrician, but also know that you can pursue developmental screening without waiting for your doctor's referral. Early intervention services in many regions are available for children showing developmental differences even before a formal diagnosis exists. You document what you're seeing. Videos are incredibly helpful. Capture moments of your baby engaged in these repetitive behaviors. Capture attempts at interaction to show whether they respond to their name or to social bids. This documentation helps professionals see patterns and make informed recommendations. You then begin incorporating specific strategies at home that support social connection and regulation. This means increasing face-to-face interaction times even if your baby doesn't initially seem interested, because the brain builds what it practices. It means reducing background stimulation so your baby's sensory system isn't constantly overwhelmed, making social information easier to process. It means following your baby's lead during play while gently inserting yourself into their focus, becoming a bridge between their preferred activities and social connection. The transformation that can occur when parents recognize these signs early and respond with informed support is remarkable. I've seen families who noticed hand flapping and visual fixations in their 4-month-old, who worked with occupational therapists and developmental specialists to create a sensory-rich, socially engaging home environment, whose child by age 2 was showing strong social reciprocity and flexible play skills. The stereotypies didn't disappear entirely, because those repetitive movements serve a real regulatory function, but they became less dominant, less interfering, and the child developed multiple ways to connect and communicate. The parents learned to recognize when their child needed sensory input and provided appropriate outlets, trampoline time instead of hand flapping, joint compression activities instead of head rocking. They learned to read their child's unique nervous system and support it rather than fight against it. What emerged wasn't a child who became neurotypical but a child whose autistic neurology was supported in developing flexibility, communication, and connection. That's what early intervention makes possible, not a cure or a fix, but an optimization of development during the period when the brain is forming its fundamental pathways. What breaks my heart is knowing how many families miss this window. The average age of autism diagnosis remains between 3 and 4 years old, despite the fact that signs are present in infancy. By 3 or 4, patterns are much more established, the brain is less plastic, and intervention requires more intensive effort to achieve the same gains that come almost effortlessly when started in the first year of life. We miss this window partly because of limited professional training. Most pediatricians receive minimal education about early autism signs and focus their assessments on gross motor and language milestones, which often look relatively typical in babies who will later be diagnosed. We miss it partly because of parental fear. Nobody wants to be the parent who overreacts, who seems neurotic, who labels their baby unnecessarily. But here's what I want you to understand. Observation isn't labeling. Seeking evaluation isn't catastrophizing. Getting support for your baby's development isn't giving up on them. It's the opposite. It's fighting for them during the exact moment when your advocacy can make the most profound difference in their life. The broader message here extends beyond autism. What we're really talking about is a cultural shift in how we understand infant development. For too long, we've operated on a model that treats babies as simple, their behaviors as random or meaningless until they reach certain ages. But babies are sophisticated communicators from birth. Their movements, their gaze patterns, their vocalizations, their sensory responses, All of these are rich with information about how their brains are organizing the world. When we learn to read that information with nuance and respond to it with understanding, we become more effective partners in our children's development, regardless of whether they're autistic or neurotypical. Every baby benefits from parents who observe closely, who respond contingently, who create environments that support rather than overwhelm their developing nervous system. The specific signs I've shared with you today matter intensely for early autism recognition, but the underlying principle, that infant behavior is meaningful communication about nervous system states and needs, that applies to every child you'll ever care for. So here's what I want you to take with you. If your baby is showing one or two of these patterns occasionally, that alone isn't cause for concern. If your baby is showing multiple stereotypies frequently, if they're lasting beyond the age when they typically diminish, if they're occurring alongside limited social responsiveness or unusual sensory patterns, then it's worth having a conversation with a developmental specialist. Trust your instincts. You know your baby better than anyone. If something feels different, if you're not quite sure but something in your gut is telling you to pay attention, honor that. Seek evaluation, not because you want to find a problem, but because you want to understand your child as deeply as possible and give them whatever support might be helpful. And remember, early signs don't predict severity. Some babies who show pronounced stereotypies in infancy develop strong skills with support. Some babies who show minimal early signs face significant challenges later. The goal isn't to predict the future. The goal is to understand the present and respond to your child's actual nervous system, their actual needs, right now, during the time when that response matters most. Your baby doesn't need you to be perfect. Your baby needs you to be present, to be observant, to be willing to see them clearly and love them exactly as they are while also giving them every tool possible to navigate this world. That's not helicopter parenting. That's not anxiety. That's devotion. That's what transforms outcomes. That's what builds brains.